Hey, ChatGPT. I just came to know that there are 101 contradictions in the Bible. Jack and Wilson will analyze them, but I would like to check with you directly, since you have the data set of all versions of the Bible, right? Okay, so how many pairs of clean animals did Noah take into the ark? 2. Genesis 6 verses 19 to 20, or 7. Genesis 7 verse 2? Why the contradiction in God's instructions? How old was Ahaziah when he began to reign over Jerusalem? Was he 22 years old? 2 Kings 8 verse 26, or 42 years old? 2 Chronicles 22 verse 2? Did Jesus bear his own cross? According to John 19 verse 17, Jesus carried it himself. But Matthew 27 verse 32 says Simon of Cyrene carried it. Which is correct? How did Judas die? Did he hang himself? Matthew 27 verse 5. Or did he fall and his body burst open? Acts 1 verse 18? To me, it seems like these are contradiction by 10 authors who wrote the Bible. Otherwise, there should not be any contradiction in God's word, right? Hey everyone, before we dive into that, I was delving into my YouTube channel analytics and noticed most of you who watch my videos are not subscribed to the channel. Would you do me a huge favor, please, and hit the subscribe button? It really motivates me and helps the channel to grow so I can do more videos just like the one you're about to watch. So without further ado, let's dive in.
Quran chapter 2, verse 79. So woe to those who write the scripture with their own hands, then say, "This is from Allah," in order to exchange it for a small price. Woe to them for what their hands have written, and woe to them for what they earn. This verse suggests that some people altered scripture for worldly gain. Cleophy, there is a lot to say, but I better reserve my right to stay quiet since we got Jack and Wilson. Let's see what they have to say on this topic.
Thank you so much, ChatGPT. Let's dive deeper into this chapter together with Jack and Wilson.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. We got a lot of feedback on our last deep dive, and one of the things that came up was this booklet called 101 Bible Contradictions. And some folks were really intrigued by it. So we thought, let's crack this thing open and take a look.
Let's do it.
Now, look, before we get started, let me just say right off the bat, this is not about, attacking anybody's beliefs or telling you what you should or shouldn't think.
Right.
Instead, we just want to approach this with a kind of open mind and look at the text critically.
Mm-hmm.
And the booklet actually kind of sets up this interesting analogy, right? It says, imagine you're in a courtroom.
Oh, okay.
And you have a witness on the stand, and that witness gives 101 contradictory statements. Would you find their testimony, super reliable?
Probably not.
So we're going to apply that same lens to these biblical texts and see what we can uncover.
Yeah, and with 101 contradictions, we've got a lot to dig into.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking numerical discrepancies, conflicting genealogies, conflicting accounts of events, and even some, theological clashes.
It's going to be wild.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating ride.
So let's start with something that might surprise some folks. The Bible is full of numbers.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Sometimes, those numbers just don't quite add up.
That's true.
Take the story of King David and his decision to count his fighting men.
Oh, right.
So this story appears in both 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, but the numbers they give are different.
Yes. 2 Samuel says there were 800,000 fighting men in Israel and then 500,000 in Judah.
Uh-huh.
But when you go to 1 Chronicles, it gives you 11,100,000 for Israel and then 470,000 for Judah.
That's a huge difference.
It is a significant difference.
And it's not just the fighting men, right? Even the length of the famine that God threatened David with as punishment for the census, that's different too.
That's right.
7 years in 2 Samuel, 3 years in 1 Chronicles. So what's going on here? Some people might say, oh, these are just simple scribal errors, mistakes made when these texts were copied over centuries.
Yeah. That's one way to look at it.
But what if it's not just a simple mistake?
Mm-hmm.
What if these differences are intentional? Could they, reflect different authors writing at different times, maybe with different perspectives or even agendas?
It's definitely possible. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does. And, this whole idea of multiple perspectives, that's something we're going to see throughout our deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of different perspectives, let's move on to the genealogical contradictions.
Okay.
Particularly those surrounding Jesus's family tree.
Right.
Yeah.
This is where the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, they offer some really interesting discrepancies.
Yeah.
They both trace Jesus's lineage back to King David, which, was really important at the time for establishing his messianic credentials.
Right.
But they do it through different sons of David.
Oh.
Matthew traces the lineage through Solomon.
Got it.
While Luke goes through Nathan.
It's like having two family photo albums that don't quite match.
Exactly. And the differences continue.
Yeah.
Even with, closer relatives.
Yeah. Like even who Joseph's father was.
Right. Matthew says Jacob.
And Luke says Heli.
Exactly. So what do we make of this? Some scholars believe that Matthew's presenting like a legal lineage.
Okay.
Focused on inheritance rights and kingship.
Interesting.
While Luke's offering a biological lineage tracing the actual, bloodline.
Uh-huh.
Others see symbolic meanings kind of embedded in these genealogies, highlighting different aspects of Jesus's identity and mission.
Like a puzzle, isn't it? Trying to piece together these different interpretations and figure out what these discrepancies might reveal about the author's intentions and, and how early Christian beliefs were developing.
Absolutely. And it's a puzzle that really requires us to, think critically and consider the historical context, the different theological perspectives, and the possibility of multiple interpretations.
Okay, now get ready for this, because we're about to step into some potentially controversial territory.
Oh.
We're going to talk about conflicting accounts of major events in the Bible.
Got it.
Let's start with the capture of Jerusalem.
Okay, yeah.
This one's really interesting because in the book of Joshua, you find verses that seem to say Joshua and the Israelites, they captured Jerusalem.
Right.
But then other verses in the same book seem to suggest that they didn't.
Yeah.
So did they or didn't they? It's like the Bible's giving us mixed signals.
Well, there are several ways to approach this.
Okay.
Some scholars believe that, these conflicting accounts might reflect different sources or traditions that were later, compiled into the book of Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
Others suggest that the text might have been edited or revised over time, leading to these discrepancies.
It's like trying to piece together a historical jigsaw puzzle.
Yes.
Where some of the pieces just don't quite fit. And speaking of conflicting accounts, let's talk about John the Baptist's recognition of Jesus.
Okay, yeah.
So some passages suggest that John recognized Jesus even before his baptism, while others indicate that he didn't.
Right.
For example, in Matthew, we see John initially hesitant to baptize Jesus, right?
Uh-huh.
Recognizing him as, the more powerful one.
Yeah.
But then in John's gospel, it seems like John didn't fully recognize Jesus until after the baptism.
Right.
When the Spirit descended and God spoke from heaven.
That's right.
So what do we make of that?
Well, these different accounts, they could reflect the evolution of the story over time.
Okay.
With each gospel writer kind of shaping the narrative to emphasize certain theological points.
Got it.
Or to address, specific questions or concerns within their communities.
It's a good reminder that, the Gospels were written decades after the events they described, and oral traditions, might have evolved or been reinterpreted in the process.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of, understanding the historical context and the different theological perspectives that shape these narratives.
Okay, let's dive into another dramatic story with conflicting details.
Okay.
Judas's betrayal of Jesus.
Right.
Matthew's gospel describes Judas identifying Jesus with a kiss.
Yeah.
But John's gospel suggests Judas couldn't even get close enough to Jesus for a kiss.
Interesting.
So what's going on there?
Well, this difference in detail, it could be due to the author's drawing on different sources or traditions.
Okay.
It also raises the question of, their intentions in telling this story. John's gospel, known for its symbolic and theological depth, might have focused on the deeper meaning of Judas's actions rather than the literal act itself.
Yeah, it's fascinating how such a seemingly small detail can lead to such different interpretations of the event and the characters involved.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what makes studying these contradictions so rewarding. It forces us to look beyond the surface and to engage with the complexities of the text. It's not about, finding simple answers, but rather about asking deeper questions and exploring the richness of biblical interpretation.
Okay, get ready, because we're about to step into a theological minefield.
All right.
Contradictions that challenge fundamental belief.
Okay.
Let's start with the question of whether every man sins.
Okay.
So 1 Kings 8.46 states pretty clearly there is no man who does not sin.
Mm-hmm.
And we find similar statements in other parts of the Bible.
Yeah.
But then we have 1 John, which seems to suggest that true Christians cannot sin. Because they are born of God and have God's nature within them.
Right.
So which is it? Does everyone sin, or are true Christians exempt?
That's a big question.
It seems like a pretty fundamental contradiction.
It is. And, this apparent contradiction has sparked centuries of theological debate.
Oh, I bet.
One way to understand it is to, consider the context of each passage.
Right.
The verses in 1 Kings and other books might be speaking in a general sense about the fallen nature of humanity.
Got it.
While 1 John might be emphasizing the transformative power of, being born again and the potential for a life, free from sin through Christ.
It's like the Bible is presenting us with two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
The reality of human sinfulness
Yeah.
and the possibility of spiritual transformation.
Exactly. And it challenges us to grapple with, the complexities of Christian theology.
Yeah.
And to consider how these seemingly opposing ideas might actually coexist within the broader framework of faith.
Okay, let's move on to another theological puzzle. The question of who bears whose burdens.
Oh, okay.
So in Galatians 6.2, we're instructed to bear one another's burdens, right? Suggesting a communal responsibility within the Christian community.
Right.
But then just a few verses later, we're told that each man will have to bear his own load, emphasizing individual accountability.
Interesting.
So which is it?
Yeah.
Are we supposed to share each other's burdens or focus on carrying our own? It's like the Bible is giving us mixed signals again.
Well, instead of seeing these verses as, contradictory, we could view them as complementary.
Okay.
Perhaps they're reflecting the tension between, communal support and personal responsibility, both of which are essential aspects of the Christian life.
It's like the Bible is acknowledging the complexity of human relationships
and
the need for both interdependence and individual growth.
Exactly. It's not always about, finding simple black and white answers, but rather about embracing the nuances and tensions within these teachings.
Well, I'm definitely feeling those nuances and tensions right now. I think we've all earned a little break after grappling with those theological conundrums.
Yeah, for sure.
But don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into these fascinating biblical contradictions.
Sounds good. I'm ready for more.
Me too.
Let's do it.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into these biblical contradictions.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride so far.
Before the break, we were really getting into some head-scratching discrepancies, especially in the Gospels.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I'm ready to jump right back in. Are you?
Absolutely. There's still so much more to uncover, and what we're seeing is that these contradictions, instead of kind of undermining the Bible, they actually invite us to engage with it on this deeper, more critical level.
Totally agree. It's like we're peeling back these layers of history and interpretation with each discrepancy we encounter.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dive back into the Gospels.
Right.
With a closer look at some of the details surrounding the crucifixion.
Okay.
One that really stood out to me was the question of whether Jesus ever taught anything in secret.
Oh, right.
So in John's Gospel, Jesus clearly states, I have said nothing secretly. But then we have verses in Mark and Matthew that suggest Jesus did teach certain things privately to his disciples, explaining things that he didn't share openly with the crowds. So did he or didn't he? It seems like a pretty big contradiction.
Well, perhaps it depends on how we understand the word secret or private.
Okay.
Maybe Jesus taught openly to everyone, but reserved certain, explanations or interpretations for his inner circle of disciples. Or maybe these different accounts reflect the evolution of, early Christian beliefs about Jesus's teachings, with some groups developing a more esoteric tradition.
Interesting.
Focused on hidden knowledge.
That's a really interesting point. It makes you wonder about the different ways these early Christian communities, understood and interpreted Jesus's message.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to another puzzling detail.
Okay.
The timing of the crucifixion. Mark's gospel places Jesus on the cross at the 6th hour.
Yeah.
But John's gospel says he was still in Pilate's court at that time.
This is one of those contradictions that has puzzled scholars for centuries.
I bet. So what's the deal? How do we explain that?
Well, some suggest it might be due to different timekeeping systems.
Oh, okay.
Used by the gospel writers.
Right. Back then, there wasn't, a standardized cloche.
Exactly.
You could all agree on.
We take that for granted now.
So maybe it's not a contradiction in terms of the actual events, but just a difference in how those events were recorded.
Exactly. It could also be that, John, writing later than Mark, might have rearranged events for theological or, dramatic purposes, highlighting certain aspects of the story he wanted to emphasize.
It's like he's creating a different kind of narrative, maybe to appeal to a particular audience or to address specific theological questions.
Exactly.
Okay, let's shift gears and explore contradictions found in other parts of the Bible.
Sounds good.
One that really caught my eye was the question of whether God changes his mind.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
So in 1 Samuel, God tells Samuel that he regrets making Saul king.
Right.
It seems pretty straightforward God changed his mind.
Yeah, that's how it reads.
But then, just a few verses later in the same book, we're told that God does not lie or repent because he is not a man.
Okay.
So, which is it? Does God change his mind or not? That's a pretty big question.
It is a big question. And this is where, understanding the nuances of biblical language and interpretation becomes really crucial.
Got it.
Some scholars suggest that God's repentance might be understood as a change in his actions.
Okay.
Or his dealings with humanity. Not a change in his, eternal nature or will.
Right.
It's not that God literally changes his mind, but rather that his response to human actions might shift.
So maybe it's more about how God interacts with us, rather than a fundamental change in his being.
Exactly. Yeah. It's also worth considering that, the Bible, as a collection of texts written over centuries, reflects different perspectives and literary styles. So what might seem like a contradiction to us could actually be a difference in how the authors conveyed God's nature and actions.
It's a good reminder that we need to be careful about, imposing our own modern assumptions and ways of thinking onto these ancient texts.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about another contradiction that involves a bit of biblical magic.
Okay.
The story of Moses and Aaron turning the water into blood in Egypt.
Oh, right.
So Exodus describes how Moses and Aaron turned all the water into blood as one of the plagues against Egypt. But then it says that the Egyptian magicians did the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't make sense. If all the water was already blood,
right,
how could the magicians do it too?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this kind of apparent impossibility has led some scholars to question whether these stories are, meant to be interpreted literally. Perhaps they're symbolic or allegorical, conveying, deeper truths about God's power and the futility of resisting his will.
It's like those stories are meant to teach us something deeper than just the literal events themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to a contradiction that involves one of the most famous stories in the Bible.
Okay, which one?
David and Goliath.
Oh, right. Everyone knows the story of David slaying the giant.
Yeah.
It's in 1 Samuel, clear as day.
Right.
But then we have a passage in 10 Samuel that claims Elhanan killed Goliath.
Wait, hold on. So who actually killed Goliath?
Yeah, that's the question, right?
David or Elhanan?
This is one of those contradictions that has led to a lot of scholarly head-scratching.
I bet. So what are the theories?
Well, some propose that there might have been two different giants with the same name.
Okay.
While others suggest a possible scribal error.
Okay.
Or a corruption in the text over time.
It's like those copy and paste errors we all make sometimes, only on a much grander scale.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the Bible, despite its sacred status, is still a product of human transmission.
Right.
And subject to the same kinds of errors and inconsistencies as any other ancient text.
Okay, this next one is about the death of King Saul.
Okay.
So the account in 1 Samuel describes Saul taking his own sword and falling on it, committing suicide. But then in 2 Samuel, we have an Amalekite coming to David, claiming he killed Saul.
Interesting. So did Saul kill himself, or was he killed by someone else?
It's two completely different versions of the same event.
It is. And this discrepancy has led to questions about, the reliability of the Amalekite's account.
Okay.
And whether he might have been lying to curry favor with David.
Right.
It's also possible that, different interpretations of the events surrounding Saul's death emerged over time, reflecting, different political or theological perspectives.
It's like we're piecing together a historical puzzle where some of the pieces are missing and others just don't seem to fit quite right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it highlights the challenges of, reconstructing historical events based on ancient texts, especially when those texts, reflect different perspectives and agendas.
Okay, let's lighten things up a bit with a less weighty contradiction.
All right, I agree.
This one involves the naming of one of Jesus's disciples.
Okay.
In Matthew's gospel, he's called Matthew, but in Mark and Luke, he's called Levi.
Huh. So was it Matthew or Levi?
It's a good question. It raises the possibility that the man might have had two names.
Right.
A common practice in those times.
Yeah, that's true.
Or maybe one was a nickname, or perhaps the gospel writers were just drawing on different sources or traditions.
Yeah.
It's like trying to figure out someone's real name when they're known by different names in different circles.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder if there are other biblical figures who might have gone by multiple names.
It's certainly possible. And it highlights the human element in these stories.
Right.
These weren't just like abstract characters.
Right.
They were real people living in a particular time and culture with their own, complex identities.
All right, let's wrap up this part of our deep dive with a contradiction that has some pretty significant theological implications.
Okay, shoot.
The timing of Jesus' crucifixion in relation to the Passover meal.
Oh, right.
So Mark seems to indicate that Jesus was crucified the day after the Passover meal, but John suggests it happened the day before.
Huh, interesting.
So was it before or after the Passover meal? It seems like a pretty important detail to get right.
It does. Well, one possibility is that, John might have been using a different calendar than Mark.
Okay.
Or there might have been, different understandings of when the Passover meal actually took place.
So maybe it's not a contradiction in terms of the actual event, but rather a difference in how they calculated the timing.
Exactly. And this highlights the importance of considering the historical and cultural context when interpreting these texts. What might seem like a clear-cut contradiction to us might actually be a reflection of, different cultural practices or ways of understanding time.
Okay, I think that's enough brain bending for one session.
Yeah, we need a break.
We'll be right back for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more fascinating contradictions and grapple with their implications for our understanding of the Bible. All right, welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive. It's been quite a journey exploring these 101 Bible contradictions.
It really has. And I think it's really highlighted how these contradictions, they don't diminish the Bible's value.
Right.
They actually open up these new avenues for exploration and understanding.
I totally agree. It's like with each discrepancy, we're challenged to dig a little deeper, question our assumptions, appreciate the richness and complexity of these ancient texts.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's dive right back in.
All right.
With a contradiction surrounding the story of Joseph being sold into slavery.
Okay.
So in Genesis, we're told that Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites.
Yeah.
But then later, it says the Midianites sold him to Potiphar.
Right. So who actually sold Joseph?
Yeah, it's like a game of biblical telephone. Where the story changes slightly with each retelling.
That's a good way to put it.
So how do we explain that?
Well, some scholars believe this discrepancy might, be explained by the fact that the Ishmaelites and Midianites were interconnected groups.
Okay.
Possibly even using those terms, interchangeably.
Gotcha.
Others suggest that the text might have been compiled from different sources, each with its own version of the story.
It makes you wonder about the process of assembling these biblical texts,
Yeah.
Were there editors trying to reconcile different versions?
Right.
Or did they just preserve the variations they found?
Those are great questions.
Yeah.
And they remind us that, the Bible isn't this single monolithic text that just dropped out of the sky.
Right.
But rather a collection of writings.
Yeah.
Compiled and edited over centuries.
Right.
Reflecting different voices, perspectives, and even theological agendas.
Okay, let's move on to a contradiction surrounding Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Okay.
So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus prays to God to prevent the crucifixion.
Yeah.
But in John's gospel, he seems to accept his fate.
Interesting. So did he pray to avoid the cross or to embrace it?
Yeah, it seems like a pretty big difference in his emotional state.
It does, but, perhaps it reflects the complexity of Jesus's human experience.
Sure.
On the one hand, he was fully God,
Right.
aware of his divine mission and destiny.
Uh-huh.
But on the other hand, he was also fully human, facing the very real prospect of a horrific death.
Right.
So it's natural that he would, wrestle with those conflicting emotions.
Yeah.
Even praying for a different outcome while ultimately submitting to God's will.
It makes Jesus seem more relatable, doesn't it?
It does.
To know that even he struggled with fear and doubt in the face of suffering.
Absolutely. It humanizes him in a way that makes his sacrifice even more meaningful, I think.
Yeah.
It shows us that even in our darkest moments, even when we question and struggle, we can still choose to trust in God's plan.
Okay, let's wrap up our deep dive with one last contradiction.
All right, let's do it.
This one involves the question of whether anyone other than Jesus ascended to heaven.
Okay.
So in John the Gospel, Jesus says, "No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man."
Right, yeah.
But then we have the story of Elijah being taken up to heaven in a whirlwind.
Right. So was Elijah an exception?
It seems like it.
Well, this is a great example of how the same event can be described in very different ways.
Okay.
Leading to, these apparent contradictions.
Right.
Some scholars believe that, Elijah's ascent might have been to a different realm.
Okay.
Or that the language used is symbolic.
Gotcha.
Others suggest that, John's statement might refer specifically to a permanent dwelling in heaven.
Okay.
Which only Jesus, as the Son of God, could attain.
So maybe it's not a contradiction in terms of the event itself, but rather a difference in how that event is understood and interpreted.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway from our entire deep dives, I think.
Yeah.
These contradictions challenge us to move beyond a simplistic, literalistic reading of the Bible.
Right.
And to engage with its deeper meanings and layers of interpretation.
It's like we've been given this glimpse behind the curtain, seeing how these texts were assembled, how they evolved over time, and how different communities have wrestled with their meaning.
And in that process, we've discovered that, the Bible isn't a book of easy answers.
Right.
But rather a source of ongoing conversation, exploration, and even debate.
Yes.
It's a living text that continues to speak to us across the centuries, challenging us to grapple with its complexities and to find meaning in its ambiguities.
Well said. And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding. It's not about arriving at definitive answers, but about embracing the journey of discovery and wrestling with these challenging questions.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up our exploration of these biblical contradictions, I just want to encourage everyone to keep digging.
Yeah, keep questioning.
Keep questioning and keep the conversation going.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
I'm excited to share some great news with our Hindi-speaking viewers. We have created a separate channel just for you, and all the videos are in Hindi. You can find the link at youtube.com/@CleoPhiHindi, which is also mentioned in the description below. Thank you for joining us for today's podcast. I hope you've gained some valuable insights. If you're a truth seeker, yearning for divine light and ready to step out of darkness, now is your moment. The truth is that Allah is the one and only creator of the universe. He has sent over 124,000 messengers and prophets to guide humanity, starting with Adam and culminating with the final messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them all. If you resonate with this message, you might be ready to embrace Islam. Simply recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. For further support, feel free to join our WhatsApp group. You can send us a private message there. The link is in the video description. Don't wait until it's too late. We look forward to connecting with you soon.